Brandon DeWilde was only 30 years old when everything came to a sudden screeching halt on a quiet road in Colorado. The headlines would later strip the last of his privacy, actor killed in camper crash. Yet the world had moved on so swiftly from the wonder of his youth that few remembered just how bright his star had once burned. But imagine for a moment a small boy standing backstage on a Broadway set in the early 1950s. Messy blonde hair, luminous eyes widened in both awe and nerves as he waited for his cue. He was trembling, excited, terrified, alive. It was in that electric moment, invisible to the audience, that would soon fall in love with him, that the seeds of a remarkable but brief career were planted. That boy was Brandon DeWilde, and the trajectory of his life would encompass both the dazzling power of early fame and the crushing weight of an unkind destiny. His story remains one of Hollywood's most poignant, hidden tragedies, a life that, in many ways, had only just begun. By the time he was 7, Brandon was the star child performer of a hit Broadway play. By the time he was 11, he had become a cinematic icon for his role in Shane, an on-screen presence so natural, so vulnerable, and so sincere that audiences could not help but be charmed. As he emerged in the 1950s, Hollywood was in the twilight of its golden age. Television was beginning to lure away viewers from theaters. Studios were scrambling to adapt, and younger audiences were craving fresh, unvarnished faces on screen. Child actors were in high demand, often thrust into the spotlight with minimal attention to their emotional growth. Brandon arrived at precisely the moment the industry was ripe for new possibilities. He radiated the innocent American boy, but behind that sweet face was a complexity and intelligence that few recognized until it was too late. Long before cameras rolled and scripts were memorized, Brandon had come from a lineage steeped in the arts. Born Andre Brandon DeWilde on April 9, 1942, in Brooklyn, New York, he was the son of Frederick A. Fritz DeWilde, a stage manager, and Eugenia Wilson DeWilde, a former stage actress. Growing up in a theater family meant late-night rehearsals and bohemian gatherings. It also meant his cradle was sometimes a backstage trunk, and his lullabies might be the faint roar of an audience. Performing and storytelling were as natural to him as breathing. Still, no one could predict that by age 7, he would become one of the youngest performers ever to star on Broadway, or that he would win the Donaldson Award for his performance in The Member of the Wedding before most children even learned to ride a bicycle. The post-war years in America held an almost mythic optimism. GI Bills, surging suburban dreams, a baby boom, and families flocked to the movies to see heroic men, resilient women, and the new generation of cherubic child stars. Brandon fit the mold perfectly and yet stood apart from the saccharine cuteness many child actors had to force. He had an innate sincerity that set him apart. Directors took note. They saw a child who could convey a complicated range of emotions without stepping into overacting. In a 1952 audition for the Paramount film Shane, Brandon reportedly impressed director George Stevens by delivering lines with such earnestness that Stevens leaned over to a colleague and whispered, "He's already living that character." It was a simple statement, but it expressed the unique quality that would make Brandon's performance so unforgettable. His breakout role in Shane catapulted him into the national spotlight. Cast as Joey Starrett, the young boy who idolizes the mysterious gunslinger played by Alan Ladd, Brandon became the emotional anchor of the story. Viewers saw the entire moral arc of the film through Joey's eyes. His wide-eyed wonder, quiet longing for bravery, and moral clarity in a world of violence resonated deeply. Audiences who'd spent decades admiring rugged leading men suddenly found themselves enraptured by a child's perspective. With his plaintive cry of "Shane, come back," Brandon managed to capture something primal, the desperate wish to hold on to purity in a world that forces one to grow up too quickly. A child star had been born, and all of Hollywood took note. Off-screen, however, the sudden wave of attention was far more disruptive. Brandon was barely in his teens, and he was suddenly recognized everywhere, hounded for autographs, and placed in the precarious position of needing to deliver a perfect image. Child actors in the 1950s faced a unique problem. The studios and the public wanted them to remain children forever, even though time and puberty march inexorably forward. Brandon's parents were supportive, yet, by some accounts, heavily invested in ensuring he continued to work. There were early signs of tension. His mother allegedly scolded him for playing too rough with other children, cautioning that any injury might stall his career. Meanwhile, his father was proud but distant, absorbed in the hustle of stage management and the swirling adult environment of the theater world. Brandon's emotional landscape, shaped by adult ambition and the weird mixture of adoration and scrutiny, was fragile from the start. Little is written about Brandon's earliest heartbreaks or his personal struggles because he wasn't the kind of star who splashed his private life across gossip columns. Yet behind the scenes, he felt the pang of that dual existence, child and celebrity. In a rare interview that surfaced in a 1962 Hollywood Weekly piece, a then-teenage Brandon confided, "I love acting, but I get nervous that I won't be liked when the newness wears off." It's a simple statement, but it reveals the vulnerable mind of a young artist who had already tasted the fleeting nature of public favor. The heartbreak was the slow, creeping realization that fame could evaporate as quickly as it appeared. During the 1950s, as television cemented its place in American homes, Brandon also began to appear on small screens. He starred in episodes of popular TV anthologies and drama series, showcasing a presence that critics described as wise beyond his years. Producers marveled at how calmly he could handle pressure. If the set was in chaos, Brandon would often be found quietly reading or rehearsing lines. Yet by the late 1950s and early 1960s, something shifted. The innocence that had made him so compelling as a boy was gradually giving way to adolescent restlessness. Audiences adored the child, but few were ready to embrace the teen or young adult version of that same performer. In 1963, Brandon got his chance to break out of the child star mold when he landed a role in HUD, Martin Ritt's stark, brooding Western drama starring Paul Newman. In some ways, HUD was a spiritual cousin to Shane, but it was an infinitely darker film, a moral puzzle that dissected the cruelty of a changing Texas ranching family. As Lon Bannon, the nephew who struggles to reconcile his love for the charismatic but ethically bankrupt title character, Brandon delivered a performance that critics and fans lauded as nuanced and heartbreaking. He was no longer playing an innocent observer. He was a young man torn between admiration and revulsion for a destructive father figure. Off-screen, Brandon found in Paul Newman a kind of mentor. Newman reportedly encouraged Brandon to take bigger risks, to dive deeper into the emotional truth of each scene. One account from an extra on the set claimed that after a long day of filming in the scorching Texas heat, Newman and Brandon sat together, quietly talking not just about acting, but about family, regret, and life beyond the set. It is said that Newman told Brandon, "Don't ever think you're just a kid from Hollywood. You've got insight." That single piece of encouragement reportedly stuck with Brandon for the rest of his short life. Yet even with the success of HUD, critical praise didn't guarantee a smooth path. Hollywood was changing yet again. The 1960s brought about a wave of counterculture, new cinematic trends, and youth rebellion. Former child stars often found themselves adrift, typecast, or overshadowed by the next big name. Brandon attempted to navigate this new terrain by seeking roles that showed he could handle complexity. He appeared in several television series and lesser-known films, but the offers weren't as plentiful as before. He was no longer the blue-eyed, apple-cheeked boy from Shane, and the industry had a notoriously short memory for yesterday's prodigy. Behind the scenes, Brandon felt torn. To remain relevant, he had to break away from his wholesome image. One rarely discussed moment in his personal life occurred in 1963. In an obscure 1965 interview, reprinted only decades later in an out-of-print biography, a friend of Brandon's recalled that Brandon had proposed to a girlfriend in a flurry of passion after finishing HUD. The relationship fell apart within months, leaving him deeply shaken. He told me he felt guilty, like he had promised stability he couldn't deliver, said the friend. He was just a kid who wanted to feel normal. He wanted a wife, a home, a sense of belonging. Rumor has it that Brandon had confided to her that the most real moment of his life was on the set of Shane, when he was hugging Alan Ladd's character, because it was the closest thing he ever felt to fatherly affection. While we may never know the full truth of these private confessions, they echo an overarching theme in Brandon's life, a search for authenticity and emotional grounding in a world that kept pigeonholing him into archetypes. In the mid-1960s, as the Vietnam War raged on and social unrest bubbled in America's streets, Hollywood underwent a creative transformation. Old studio contracts were breaking down, new directors were exploring bold themes, and the notion of the anti-hero was on the rise. Brandon sensed an opening. He wanted to tackle roles that were grittier, more modern. He yearned to do something that would stretch his talent beyond the childlike sincerity for which he'd become famous. There's a little-known story, one of those rumored anecdotes whispered among old Hollywood insiders, about how Brandon auditioned for a part in a nascent production that later evolved into The Graduate. He allegedly read for the role that Dustin Hoffman would eventually make iconic. While it's unclear how serious his consideration was, the anecdote suggests that Brandon had an appetite for the type of edgy, boundary-pushing stories that were capturing the zeitgeist. Yet whether due to poor management, timing, or luck, these roles never quite materialized for him. But Brandon did find work. He made guest appearances in popular television series like Alfred Hitchcock Presents and The Virginian, and took parts in smaller films. Curiously, he also took a brief hiatus to perform in summer stock theater, returning to his roots and rediscovering the immediacy of a live audience. For a few months, he thrived in smaller venues, playing in front of a few hundred people in provincial theater towns, far away from the glare of Hollywood. In one of those plays, an obscure production in Maine, he's said to have quietly told a stagehand, "I forgot how good it feels to be scared every night, scared of the audience, but also longing for that moment of total connection." He was a man in his early 20s, grappling with the knowledge that what had once come easily to him as a child star was now something he had to fight to preserve, the passion and purity of his craft. During this time, he also married and began to think of starting a family. For a while, it seemed like Brandon had found a measure of stability. But while the 1960s were a decade of liberation for many, they were fraught with hidden pressures for someone whose entire childhood had been spent in the public eye. The Hollywood system was notoriously short on support structures for the emotional and mental health of its performers. Child stars grew up with the world watching, but few had the guidance they needed to handle transitions in their personal and professional lives. Brandon was no exception. He had heartbreaks, financial strains, and at times he struggled with the knowledge that his star power had diminished. If one looks carefully at old tabloids from the late 1960s, those yellowed pages overshadowed by bigger names like Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton, and the Beatles, there are small mentions of Brandon checking into a hospital for exhaustion or nervous tension. Rumors circulated about possible depression. His marriage, while precious to him, also came under strain as he wrestled with professional uncertainty. Studios were less inclined to take a risk on a former child star who was no longer the new face on the block. Some of Brandon's peers from that era recalled an increasing sense of frustration emanating from him. He wanted to evolve, but he found the opportunities limited by Hollywood's short attention span. Among the lesser-known details of his life was his growing curiosity about spirituality and introspection. In a 1968 letter to a close friend, found years later in the friend's personal papers, Brandon wrote, "I still believe in that child's wonder I felt on stage at 7. I just need to reconnect to that sense of awe." The same letter mentions his desire to collaborate with younger, independent filmmakers who were breaking into the scene with unconventional films. Brandon had an aesthetic yearning for authenticity, for a raw exploration of character that he felt was lacking in many commercial scripts offered to him. He was searching not just for professional revitalization, but for an inner peace that had eluded him since childhood. Despite his best efforts, cracks were beginning to show in the facade. By the early 1970s, Brandon was divorced, had a young son, and was in flux with his career. Though not a tabloid mainstay, he was occasionally the subject of hushed rumors. Was he struggling with alcohol or prescription pills? Did he harbor bitterness about being typecast as the eternal boy? The evidence remains unclear, and many who knew him either refused to speak or have since passed on. What is unmistakable is that he was at a crossroads, searching for a project, or perhaps a life path, that would bring him the recognition and creative satisfaction he craved. He was not an actor chasing empty fame. He sought depth. In an interview that rarely surfaces today, he once admitted, "I'd give all the applause in the world for just one role that truly speaks to my soul." Isn't that what any artist wants? Tragically, the path ended before it could be fully realized. On July 6, 1972, while traveling in a Denver suburb, Brandon's camper van collided with a parked truck. The exact circumstances remain murky. Some accounts mention poor visibility on the road. Others suggest he may have been fatigued. He was pinned in the wreckage and died at the scene, leaving a stunned family and a legacy that had not yet found its complete resonance. The accident barely caused a ripple in a world preoccupied with Watergate and the Vietnam War. Obituaries were brief, referencing Shane as a highlight and noting that he had once been a leading light of child stardom. But the deeper story, the emotional human narrative behind that bright face, slipped into obscurity. Perhaps the reason we still talk about Brandon DeWilde at all is the extraordinary power of Shane, a film that remains one of the greatest westerns ever made. In that singular performance, he gifted the world something pure and universally relatable, a child's yearning for heroism, for moral clarity, and for the reassuring presence of someone who will not desert him. This universal longing transcends time, and it continues to resonate with every new generation that encounters the film. Yet if we look beyond that iconic role, we find a far richer portrait of a man whose destiny was shaped by the complexities of Hollywood, the relentless passage of time, and the human fragility that binds us all. In exploring his life's controversies and hidden layers, one finds little in the way of scandal that so often marks other Hollywood tales. Brandon was not known for illicit affairs or flamboyant feuds. His controversies were quieter, more existential. The slow burn of a career overshadowed by early success, the frustration of never being allowed to outgrow the cherubic image that had captured hearts in the 1950s. Some have debated whether he was mismanaged or if he lacked the fierce ambition necessary to carve out a lasting adult career. Others point to the industry's capricious nature, observing that many child stars vanish after puberty, regardless of talent. And still others believe that had he lived longer, the 1970s New Hollywood era, defined by directors like Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, and Steven Spielberg, might have been a perfect environment for Brandon's raw authenticity. One can only imagine the roles he might have inhabited if time and fate had given him a fair chance. Historians and film buffs occasionally debate the significance of Brandon's legacy. Some argue that his influence was minimal, overshadowed by more prolific child actors, or by the monumental careers of legends like James Dean and Paul Newman. Yet to dismiss Brandon is to misunderstand the quiet revolution he represented at the time. In an era dominated by stagey theatrical child performances, he brought a naturalism and depth that paved the way for subsequent generations of young actors who dared to show vulnerability without melodrama. Critics who re-examine Shane and Hud often point out that Brandon's presence elevates those films beyond genre confines, lending them a genuine emotional core. He demonstrated that childhood and adolescence on screen could be just as layered and important to cinematic storytelling as adulthood. What then are we to learn from Brandon's brief, shining journey? First, that talent and fame are not guarantees of longevity, either in one's career or in one's life. The ephemeral nature of celebrity can be as dazzling as it is destructive, especially for a sensitive soul thrust into the spotlight before he understands who he is. Second, that transitions in life, whether from childhood to adolescence or from innocence to experience, are often fraught with heartbreak, no matter how luminous one's gifts may be. And third, that the human heart, with all its longing for connection and meaning, remains the true pulse beneath every role an actor plays. Brandon gave us glimpses of that truth in each performance, and for that reason, his story remains as haunting as it is inspiring. A rarely heard anecdote that surfaced only in the early 2000s, taken from an old tape recording of an interview with a friend of the family, offers a final poignant glimpse into Brandon's inner world. The friend recalled a conversation that took place shortly before Brandon's death. Brandon apparently said he wanted to create a one-man show, blending monologues, music, and personal reflections on the Hollywood machine. He even had the working title, The Echo of Applause. According to the friend's recollection, Brandon explained that the title summed up how he felt about fame. The applause is loud when you're up there, but once you step off that stage, you only hear the echo of it, fading until it's like you dreamed it. He never got the chance to see that idea realized, but in that wistful notion lies the essence of who he was, a performer who wanted to connect deeply with others, to share his truths, and to find in art a refuge from the uncertainty of life. Were Brandon alive today, there's little doubt he'd have stories to tell about the golden age he glimpsed, the revolutionary changes of the 1960s, and all the roads not taken. He might have collaborated with avant-garde directors or embraced the era of independent cinema, forging a second act to his career that allowed him to finally inhabit the grown-up roles he'd always craved. Or perhaps he would have left Hollywood entirely, opting for a quieter life enriched by fatherhood, painting, or music. We'll never know. And in that unknowing lies the bittersweet heart of his tale. He was, at his core, a glimpse of something deeply human in a time when Hollywood often traded in manufactured fantasy. That humanity endures in the best of his work, shimmering like a forgotten relic, waiting for rediscovery. He left us, fittingly enough, on a road he could not complete, halfway between places, at a moment when life still had so much to offer. Though the echoes of applause faded, what endures is his testament to the fragile magic of youth, the courage it takes to face adulthood, and the ultimate mystery of how fate can intervene at any moment. The brevity of his existence and the purity of his craft merge to form a story that is by turns tragic, inspiring, and profoundly instructive. And that's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.